Please be seated. When I was driving out here to the church on Friday morning, my almost 5-year-old Jackson was strapped into his car seat behind me, and he finally asked me that question that every child eventually comes to. Daddy, why is the sky blue? I explained that the sunlight comes through space and hits water vapor suspended in the upper atmosphere, and it turns it blue. Why? So I started making up things. Just like the ocean, when the sunlight shines on the ocean, it turns blue too. So I spent the next 10 minutes making a chain of lies to cover up my earlier explanations about why the sky is blue. As often as I could, I tried to derail him by saying, "Well, honey, why do you think it works that way?" He's wise to it too. Jackson is at a stage where he constantly asks me questions like, why is that mountain there? Why doesn't the cat want to sit on my lap? Why is macaroni and cheese yellow? How come my bike can balance with me on it? And things like, where do the kids who don't have houses sleep? Now, during Holy Week, a couple of weeks ago, Jackson's questions turned more serious. He was very concerned about Jesus dying, and he asked why the bad guys did that, did it hurt a lot, and on and on and on. So in addition to planning sermons for Palm Sunday and the Easter Vigil, I was playing verbal ping pong with a small child about the nature of the crucifixion. Now, interestingly, when Easter came along, the questions stopped. When I asked Jackson about what happened on Easter morning, he just shrugged and said, "Jesus came back." He was way more concerned about how the Easter Bunny knows our address. Now, at the same time that he stopped asking questions, Jackson declared himself to be a butterfly. He also said he was an angel and that he could fly. And this past week up here at Peter Pan Preschool, they've been learning all about caterpillars and cocoons and butterflies. And on Wednesday, he wore an enormous pair of butterfly wings that he had made and claimed that when he ran around as fast as possible, he could feel himself starting to lift off of the ground with the wings. So on our car rides, he's been telling me about caterpillars and cocoons and butterflies. So somehow, at less than 5 years of age, he seems to have some kind of intuitive sense of transformation and rebirth. And I have to be honest with you, this week was yearning for that kind of simple acceptance while I spent the week in my office trying to make sense of the resurrection. My goal was to make that fantastical claim at the heart of Christianity reasonable for all of you in church this morning. So I spent the week with my study Bible and my hefty biblical commentaries, ready to make the resurrection understandable to all of you. It turns out it's hard. Did you know that just the New Testament alone contains 6 different versions of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus? 6 versions of the very same event. And Paul himself describes his conversion as a meeting of the resurrected Jesus, just like the ones which the disciples had in the Gospels. But he uses some very strange language to describe that experience. In the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul says that he was, quote, caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. That does not sound to me very much like the gospel stories of this fleeting Jesus who the disciples see. These 6 different accounts of the same story of Paul's experience are fascinating and kind of ecstatic. But the trouble is, when you read all 6 of them, they don't line up very neatly. They just don't agree very much on the details of that event. So it's hard to harmonize them into a single story. You get a sense of death and rebirth, but if you read them literally, they just don't make a whole lot of sense together. So that sent me back to thinking about Jackson's experience of being a butterfly, and might it be more useful to think about oneself as a butterfly than to dissect these stories with a cool academic scalpel. So, looking for more clarity, I turned to the Gospels. There are 14 vignettes of post-resurrection Jesus coming and meeting people. And kind of like the 6 different accounts of Paul's road to Damascus story, the Gospel accounts often don't line up as neatly as we would hope they would. For example, this is the stunning one. It always surprises me. Did you know that the Gospel of Mark has no resurrected Jesus? It's kind of surprising. Pick up the Gospel of Mark sometime. You get to the end of it, and the women flee from an empty tomb in terror, and the Gospel stops. Matthew's Gospel gives us more information. He shows a group of women finding the empty tomb, and then we have the long story of the road to Emmaus, where Jesus is walking with a couple of disciples. They don't recognize him until they invite him to dinner, and then all of a sudden they recognize him when he breaks the bread, and then he vanishes. And then Jesus meets with his apostles and ascends to heaven. I'm getting my gospels. Then he tells the disciples that they are to go out and make disciples of all nations. Luke gives us even more detail. Again, women play a very prominent role in discovering the empty tomb. And Jesus vanishes, he ascends into heaven on Easter Day. The confusing part is that the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke also wrote the Acts of the Apostles, from which we just heard. And in the Acts of the Apostles, it takes Jesus 40 days to accomplish that. He hangs around for a long time before ascending into heaven. Now, the Gospel of John has even more stories about the resurrected Jesus. There's a great story about Peter and another disciple having a foot race to get to the empty tomb first. And then Mary Magdalene, again a woman, has a prominent role. Mary Magdalene is the first person to see the resurrected Jesus, though she initially mistakes him for a gardener. Then we get the stories we had last week, where Jesus seems to appear and disappear out of locked rooms, and then appears suddenly in a different form for Thomas. And then finally we get the last of the resurrection stories, the one we heard this morning, with the disciples out in their boat. And I love this image of Peter recognizing Jesus, putting on clothes, and then jumping into the water. And then this breakfast on the beach with cooked fish. Now these stories are packed with symbolism and metaphor, and they speak in various ways to the mystery of Jesus transcending death. But if you try and line them up like they're a history lesson, they don't make a whole lot of sense. Once again, my son Jackson's experience of being transformed into a butterfly, in a way, seems more satisfying. Now, since I could not look into the Bible and find certainty for all of you, I decided to look elsewhere. I turned to the Nicene Creed, which we will all say together in a few moments, and it summarizes the resurrection very succinctly. On the third day, he rose again in accordance with the Scriptures. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. Okay, pretty good, pretty succinct. Not a lot of detail. So, for some more detail, I turned to the library book, or the books I keep in the library in my office. And it turns out that theologians, they've written hundreds, probably thousands and thousands of books on the resurrection, and they tend to argue a lot with each other. There's a whole school of thought that says you need to read these stories literally, and I certainly sympathize with that desire for certainty, but it brings me right back to the problem of having a hard time reconciling conflicting accounts when you read them literally. Other theologians say that the gospel accounts of the resurrected Jesus are primarily imaginative projections from the community back onto their leader, whom they lost in this catastrophe of his execution. And still more theologians insist that the resurrection appearances were some kind of collective vision or trance, an experience of the presence of Jesus somehow beyond death. So suffice to say, there is not great consensus when we try to reasonably describe the resurrection. So that brings me back to Jackson, whose uncritical sense of life and transformation and rebirth as a butterfly seems kind of refreshing in the face of all the conjecture of the dry tomes written by all those theologians. My fear, though, is that by using my own child's antics as a prop for this sermon, I may be belittling the deeply held beliefs that many of you have, or the substantial questions which many of us bring to the events of Easter morning. And that is not my intent. My hope is to demonstrate the limits of approaching the central mystery of Christianity with literal questions. When we're faced with questions about the very nature of God and the universe, I think the wild, wide-eyed wonder of a child is a perfectly good response. And it's often a more honest response than trying to dissect a mystery into its constituent parts. Really, all I can say about the resurrection with certainty is that the stories we get from the Bible speak some very difficult truths about the mystery of how Jesus was in some way present in a profound way to the people he loved after he died. There was a real ongoing presence that people experienced. We can try to explain that in all kinds of ways, and certainly we've tried to do that. But it may be more satisfying to look for examples in the world around us of the endless cycles of life and death and rebirth, and even butterflies, that creation offers us. Amen.